Ah, welcome, my dear and inquisitive guest. I see you have found your way into the shadowed recesses of my humble abode. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Mortimer Crowe, your curator of curiosities, your host of horrors, your weaver of wretched wonderments. Here, within the confines of my cabinet of calamities, lies an assortment of objects so vile and peculiar that they seem to breathe with stories of their own. Do step closer. The air grows cold, and the shadows deepen as we embark upon our first tale. Ah, here it is, the inaugural artifact of our grim little gallery. What you see before you is no mere bauble, no trifling trinket to be dismissed lightly. It is a locket, tarnished and cracked, its golden filigree now dimmed by the weight of untold sorrow. Within its hollow embrace lies not the portrait of a loved one, but a shard of mirror no larger than a fingernail, yet infinitely more dangerous. Yes, this locket is no ordinary keepsake. It is a vessel of doom, a conduit for despair, and the key to a tale that will chill your very marrow. For every tarnished edge and every jagged line in its glass speaks of lives undone and hearts shattered. Let me tell you its story. This particular locket once hung around the neck of a certain Eleanor Gray, a young woman possessed of beauty so luminous it seemed to burn away all who dared gaze upon her. She was the belle of every ball, the obsession of poets and painters, and the envy of those who coveted what they could never claim. Her golden hair gleamed like sunlight on rippling water, and her eyes, oh, her eyes, they were the sort that could snare a man's soul with a single glance. Yet for all her radiance, Eleanor was plagued by a singular, insatiable desire, the need to be adored, not merely loved, but worshipped, utterly and without question. Hers was not the quiet contentment of a cherished soul, but the relentless hunger of a heart that could never be filled. Eleanor's story begins on a crisp autumn evening, the sort where the dying leaves scatter like lost dreams beneath a pale moon. She was attending yet another grand soirée, her every step followed by whispers of admiration and veiled jealousy. The grand hall was a glittering spectacle of crystal chandeliers, gilded mirrors, and music that swelled like the heartbeat of the night itself. Yet among the throng of admirers that night, her gaze fell upon a stranger, a man whose presence was as unassuming as a shadow slipping through the cracks. He was no poet, no nobleman, no glittering suitor seeking her favor. No, this man was different. He did not fawn, nor did he flinch beneath her penetrating gaze. He simply watched. The man's name was Victor Hawthorne, a reclusive artisan of peculiar repute. Rumors swirled about his work, jewelry imbued with uncanny properties, charms that whispered promises too sweet to resist. It was said that his creations could ensnare the wearer in a web of wonder or woe, depending on the artisan's whim. Intrigued, Eleanor approached him, her curiosity sharpened by her vanity. "You do not look at me as others do," she remarked, her voice as smooth as silk unraveling. Victor merely smiled, a gesture both cryptic and calculating. "Perhaps I see more than they do," he replied. His voice was soft, yet it carried an undertone that sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine, a shiver she quickly dismissed as intrigue. What followed was a dance of words and veiled intentions, a conversation that lingered long after the last candle had burned low. They spoke of beauty and its fleeting nature, of power and the price it exacts, of mirrors and the truths they cannot help but reveal. Eleanor, ever the practiced conversationalist, wove her charm with effortless grace, yet Victor met her every word with an enigmatic smile that seemed to see straight through her. Before the night was over, Victor presented her with the locket. "It is a gift, my lady, though it carries a warning. This locket will show you what lies beneath the surface of all who gaze upon you. But beware, for not all reflections are kind." Eleanor, ever the self-assured queen of her realm, laughed at his caution. She accepted the locket with a flourish, fastening it around her neck without hesitation. "I have nothing to fear from admiration," she declared, her tone as imperious as a queen's decree. Yet, as she clasped the locket, a faint chill spread across her skin, though she attributed it to the autumn air. The room seemed to dim for the briefest of moments, as though the very light recoiled from the locket's presence. The following morning, Eleanor awoke to a peculiar sensation, a weight around her neck that felt heavier than any locket should. Her fingers brushed against its cold, metallic surface, and a shiver ran through her. Dismissing the unease, she rose to begin her day, for vanity never rests, and neither did Eleanor. She stood before her gilded mirror, the morning light streaming in to frame her figure like a celestial portrait. As she admired her reflection, something peculiar caught her eye. Within the shard of mirror encased in the locket, a faint flicker moved, a glimmer that seemed alive. She leaned closer, her breath misting the glass. And then she saw it. The shard within the locket showed not her own face, but another, a grotesque, distorted visage that bore the unmistakable imprint of malice. The eyes within the shard were sunken and dark, their gaze unrelenting as if peering into the very depths of her soul. Startled, Eleanor stumbled back, clutching at the locket as if to tear it away, but an unseen force seemed to bind it to her. The moment passed, and the shard's reflection returned to normal, showing only a fragment of her beauty. "A trick of the light," she muttered, though her voice quavered. Nothing more. The day unfolded as usual, with Eleanor playing the part of the admired and envied. Yet, she could not shake the feeling that eyes were upon her, not the adoring eyes of her admirers, but something darker, unseen yet palpable. Whispers seemed to follow her, too faint to discern yet chilling all the same. That evening she hosted a grand dinner at her family estate, an affair of opulence and excess, designed to solidify her place as the center of her social sphere. Her guests arrived in droves, their laughter and admiration washing over her like a tide. But Eleanor's confidence faltered when she noticed Victor among the crowd. He stood apart, silent and watchful, his expression unreadable. As the evening wore on, Eleanor's unease grew. The locket felt heavier still, its shard seeming to pulse with an unnatural heat. She excused herself from the revelry, retreating to her private chambers for a moment of respite. There she dared to look again into the locket's shard. This time the reflection was not her own, but a tableau of the dining room below. The scene within the shard was subtly wrong. Her guests appeared distorted, their faces twisted into masks of grotesque hunger and malice. At the head of the table sat Victor, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. A knock at the door startled her, and she hastily closed the locket. It was her maid, bearing a note from Victor. The message was simple and chilling. "You wanted to see what lies beneath. Do you see it now?" Eleanor's heart pounded. She resolved to confront Victor, to demand an explanation for the horrors unfolding before her. Summoning all her poise, she descended to the dining room, her steps faltering only slightly as she approached him. "What have you done?" she hissed, her voice low enough to avoid drawing attention. Victor's smile was infuriatingly calm. "I have done nothing, my dear. The locket reveals what is already there." "Lies!" she spat. "The things I've seen, they cannot be real." "Reality is a matter of perception," he replied, his tone maddeningly serene. "And perception is rarely kind." The room seemed to close in around her, the air thick with an oppressive weight. Eleanor fled, her vision swimming as the faces of her guests blurred and twisted into grotesque forms. She locked herself in her chambers, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Clutching the locket, she whispered a desperate plea, though she knew not to whom she prayed. "Make it stop. Please make it stop." But the locket offered no solace, only the faint, mocking glimmer of the shard within. And so, my dear reader, Eleanor finds herself alone with the weight of the locket and the truths it reveals. How much of what we see in others is but a reflection of our own hidden darkness. The following morning, Eleanor awoke to a peculiar sensation, a weight around her neck that felt heavier than any locket should. Her fingers brushed against its cold, metallic surface, and a shiver ran through her. Dismissing the unease, she rose to begin her day, for vanity never rests, and neither did Eleanor. She stood before her gilded mirror, the morning light streaming in to frame her figure like a celestial portrait. As she admired her reflection, something peculiar caught her eye. Within the shard of mirror encased in the locket, a faint flicker moved, a glimmer that seemed alive. She leaned closer, her breath misting the glass, and then she saw it. The shard within the locket showed not her own face, but another, a grotesque, distorted visage that bore the unmistakable imprint of malice. The eyes within the shard were sunken and dark, their gaze unrelenting as if peering into the very depths of her soul. Startled, Eleanor stumbled back, clutching at the locket as if to tear it away, but an unseen force seemed to bind it to her. The moment passed, and the shard's reflection returned to normal, showing only a fragment of her beauty. "A trick of the light," she muttered, though her voice quavered. Nothing more. The day unfolded as usual, with Eleanor playing the part of the admired and envied. Yet she could not shake the feeling that eyes were upon her, not the adoring eyes of her admirers, but something darker, unseen, yet palpable. Whispers seemed to follow her, too faint to discern, yet chilling all the same. Every corner she turned seemed to hum with quiet judgment, and even the familiar comforts of her home felt suddenly foreign. That evening, she hosted a grand dinner at her family estate, an affair of opulence and excess designed to solidify her place as the center of her social sphere. Her guests arrived in droves, their laughter and admiration washing over her like a tide. Chandeliers glittered overhead, and the air was thick with the perfume of roses and wine. Yet, despite the splendor, Eleanor's confidence faltered when she noticed Victor among the crowd. He stood apart, silent and watchful, his expression unreadable. As the evening wore on, Eleanor's unease grew. The locket felt heavier still, its shard seeming to pulse with an unnatural heat. She excused herself from the revelry, retreating to her private chambers for a moment of respite. There she dared to look again into the locket's shard. This time, the reflection was not her own, but a tableau of the dining room below. The scene within the shard was subtly wrong. Her guests appeared distorted, their faces twisted into masks of grotesque hunger and malice. At the head of the table sat Victor, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The soundless laughter within the shard seemed to echo in her mind, growing louder with each passing second. A knock at the door startled her, and she hastily closed the locket. It was her maid, bearing a note from Victor. The message was simple and chilling. "You wanted to see what lies beneath. Do you see it now?" Eleanor's heart pounded. She resolved to confront Victor, to demand an explanation for the horrors unfolding before her. Summoning all her poise, she descended to the dining room, her steps faltering only slightly as she approached him. The faces of her guests blurred as she passed, their smiles now seeming sinister in the dim light of the hall. "What have you done?" she hissed, her voice low enough to avoid drawing attention. Victor's smile was infuriatingly calm. "I have done nothing, my dear. The locket reveals what is already there." "Lies," she spat. "The things I've seen, they cannot be real." "Reality is a matter of perception," he replied, his tone maddeningly serene. "And perception is rarely kind." The room seemed to close in around her, the air thick with an oppressive weight. Eleanor fled, her vision swimming as the faces of her guests blurred and twisted into grotesque forms. She locked herself in her chambers, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Clutching the locket, she whispered a desperate plea, though she knew not to whom she prayed. "Make it stop. Please make it stop." The locket offered no solace, only the faint, mocking glimmer of the shard within. Hours passed, and Eleanor found herself pacing, her thoughts spiraling into dark corners she had never dared visit. Every reflection, in mirrors, in windows, in the polished silver on her dresser, seemed to twist into hideous forms. The faces she had once trusted and admired now loomed as grotesque parodies, their smiles mocking her. By the time dawn broke, Eleanor had reached a breaking point. She took the locket in both hands, pulling with all her strength, but it would not budge. The chain burned against her skin, and the shard seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. Exhausted, she collapsed into a chair, her tears streaming unchecked. In the corner of the room, the shadows seemed to deepen, and for a moment, she thought she heard a low, guttural chuckle. Victor's words echoed in her mind. "The locket reveals what is already there." Could it be true? Were the horrors she saw not conjured, but merely unveiled? Her mind raced through every interaction, every smile she had charmed, every envy she had provoked. The thought that the malice reflected in the shard was her own was unbearable. Summoning the last reserves of her strength, Eleanor rose. She would find Victor, demand he undo whatever curse he had placed upon her. But as she opened the door to her chambers, the house seemed transformed. The corridors stretched unnaturally long, their walls closing in as though alive. The laughter of her guests echoed faintly, distorted into an otherworldly cacophony. Eleanor pressed forward, her steps unsteady yet determined. She would not succumb, not yet. The locket hung heavily against her chest, a cruel reminder of its presence. As she reached the grand staircase, she caught sight of Victor below, his calm, infuriating smile unwavering. "You cannot escape it," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the distorted hall. "You carry it with you." Eleanor's scream tore through the air, raw and desperate. But even as the sound faded, the locket's shard gleamed brighter, its reflection showing not the elegant, composed woman she had been, but something far darker, twisted by the weight of her own vanity. Eleanor's scream echoed through the labyrinthine corridors, but it did not bring the comfort of acknowledgement. No servants came running, no voices called out in concern. The house, her once pristine sanctuary, seemed to have turned against her, its familiar halls now unfamiliar, its warmth replaced by a sinister chill. The only sound was the faint, relentless pulsing of the locket, as if it had a heartbeat of its own. With trembling hands, Eleanor steadied herself against the banister. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her body heavy with the weight of unseen eyes. Yet, despite her fear, she forced herself to move. Victor's cryptic words reverberated in her mind. "You cannot escape it. You carry it with you." The locket, this accursed, unyielding object, had to be destroyed. She made her way to the drawing room, where the grand fireplace cast flickering shadows that seemed to mock her every step. On the mantelpiece, a brass poker gleamed in the firelight. Eleanor seized it with both hands, her knuckles whitening as she gripped it tightly. She yanked the locket from her neck, its chain biting into her skin as it resisted her pull, and hurled it onto the marble hearth. Without hesitation, she raised the poker and brought it down with all her strength. A deafening clang reverberated through the room as the poker struck the locket. Sparks flew, but the locket remained intact, its shard glinting malevolently in the firelight. Eleanor struck again, and again, each blow more desperate than the last. Yet the locket remained unscathed, its surface unmarred by her efforts. Exhausted, she collapsed to her knees, the poker slipping from her grasp. The room seemed to grow darker, the fire dimming as the shadows deepened. And then she heard it, a voice, soft and insidious, emanating from the locket. "Why do you fight me, Eleanor?" She recoiled, her eyes widening in terror. The voice was hers, yet not hers. It was distorted, warped, as if echoing from some abyssal depth. The shard began to glow, its light casting grotesque reflections on the walls. In its surface, Eleanor saw herself, but not as she was. The reflection showed her face twisted in rage, her eyes hollow and brimming with malice. Behind her loomed indistinct figures, their hands grasping at her, their mouths open in silent screams. "What are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The locket's glow intensified, the voice growing louder, more mocking. "I am you, Eleanor. I am your envy, your pride, your insatiable hunger for adoration. I am every cruel thought, every selfish deed. You invited me in, and now I am yours." Eleanor shook her head violently, her tears falling freely. "No, that's not true. I am not this." The laughter that followed was cold and hollow, reverberating through the room. "Denial will not save you. Look around, Eleanor. Your world is a reflection of what lies within." The walls of the room began to shift, their surfaces rippling like water. Faces emerged from the shadows, twisted and grotesque, their eyes accusing. Eleanor recognized them all: the maid whose duties she had dismissed with disdain, the suitors whose affections she had toyed with, the rivals she had crushed beneath her heel. Their whispers filled the air, a cacophony of reproach and despair. Eleanor clutched her head, her cries of anguish drowned by the rising tide of voices. She stumbled to her feet, her gaze darting wildly in search of escape. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing closer, the faces growing more distinct, more vivid. She reached for the poker again, this time clutching it like a talisman, but it offered no comfort against the encroaching shadows. The reflections in the shard began to move, no longer bound to the surface of the locket. They spilled into the room, ghostly and ethereal, surrounding Eleanor. Each figure carried a fragment of her past, their distorted voices replaying her cruelties in a nightmarish chorus. "You will never be free," one figure hissed, its voice resembling that of a former maid she had dismissed without cause. Another whispered, "You thrived on our misery. Now you must live with it." The faces pressed closer, their cold breath grazing her skin. And then, in the midst of her torment, she saw Victor. He stood in the doorway, his expression as calm and enigmatic as ever. The sight of him ignited a spark of rage within her, cutting through her fear like a blade. "You did this!" she screamed, lunging toward him. "You cursed me!" Victor stepped aside with a practiced ease, letting her collapse against the threshold. "I merely gave you what you asked for," he said, his voice low and measured. A glimpse beneath the surface. Eleanor turned to face him, her chest heaving, her hands trembling. "Undo it. Please, I beg you. Take it back." Victor tilted his head, his gaze inscrutable. "And what would you offer in return?" She faltered, the weight of his words sinking in. "Anything. Whatever you want. Just make it stop." A faint smile touched his lips, though it carried no warmth. "Be careful, Eleanor. Bargains have a way of binding tighter than chains." She fell silent, her desperation warring with her fear. The faces in the walls loomed closer, their whispers growing louder. Eleanor's resolve crumbled. "I don't care. I can't live like this." Victor stepped forward, his shadow enveloping her. He extended a hand, his fingers long and pale. "Then we shall make a trade." The locket pulsed against her chest, its glow almost blinding. Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before placing her trembling hand in his. The room plunged into darkness, the voices falling silent. For a moment, Eleanor thought it was over, that she had been freed. But then she realized the locket was gone, yet its weight still pressed on her chest. Her reflection stared back at her from every surface, mirrors, windows, the polished silver, but it was no longer her own. The locket's laughter echoed one final time, and Eleanor understood the terrible truth. She had traded one prison for another, and this one had no escape. The sound of the locket's laughter faded, but its oppressive presence lingered in the suffocating silence that followed. Eleanor staggered back from the mirror, her legs trembling beneath her as she collided with the decaying walls of the transformed room. Her breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, her heart hammering like a caged bird desperate for escape. She clawed at the locket's chain, but it remained resolute, searing her skin with every futile tug. Victor stood unmoving, his shadow stretching long and serpentine across the rotting floorboards. His calm, unyielding presence was a stark contrast to the chaos that churned within Eleanor. She turned to him, desperation etched into every line of her face. "What have you done to me?" she demanded, her voice cracking under the weight of her fear. This can't be real." Victor's lips curved into a faint, sardonic smile. "Reality, Eleanor, is a malleable thing. It bends to perception, and your perception has always been skewed. What you see now is merely the world you have shaped." His words struck her like a blow, igniting a flicker of rage that momentarily eclipsed her terror. "You lie. This nightmare is your doing? I didn't ask for this." Victor took a step closer, his pale eyes glinting like moonlight on still water. "Did you not? You sought to be adored, Eleanor, to wield power over others' hearts. You reveled in their envy, their longing, their despair. The locket merely amplifies what already resides within you." Eleanor's hands balled into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. "I never wanted this. I only wanted to be loved." Victor tilted his head, his expression inscrutable. "Love born of fear and manipulation is no love at all. You crafted your own prison, and now you balk at its walls." The room shifted again, the air thickening with an almost tangible malevolence. The mirror's surface rippled like disturbed water, and new figures began to emerge from its depths. These were not the twisted, grotesque faces of her past misdeeds. No, these were familiar and heartbreakingly human. Her father, who had once looked upon her with pride, her childhood friend, whose laughter she had forgotten, a young suitor whose earnest affections she had scorned. The reflections gazed at her with eyes full of sorrow and disappointment. Their lips moved, forming silent words that Eleanor could not bring herself to hear. She turned away, tears spilling down her cheeks, only to find Victor watching her with the cold detachment of a surgeon observing a failed experiment. "Make it stop," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, make it stop." Victor's expression softened, though his pity felt as cutting as his disdain. "I can end this, Eleanor, but the cost will be great." She looked at him, her tear-streaked face a mask of anguish. "I'll pay it. Whatever it is, I'll pay." His gaze bore into her, unflinching. "You misunderstand. This is not a debt you can settle with gold or promises. To undo what has been done, you must relinquish the very thing you hold most dear." Eleanor's heart lurched, dread clawing at her chest. "What do you mean?" Victor gestured toward the mirror, its surface shimmering with an otherworldly light. "Your beauty, Eleanor, the source of your power, your pride, your downfall. To be free of the locket's grip, you must forfeit the face that has inspired so much adoration and so much envy." Her breath caught, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a crushing tide. She stared at the mirror, at the reflection of her twisted visage, and the faint glimmer of her once radiant features buried beneath the grotesque distortion. Could she bear to let go of the one thing that had defined her? Victor stepped closer, his voice low and measured. The choice is yours. You may cling to your beauty and remain bound to the Lockets' curse, or you may relinquish it and find freedom. But beware, even freedom comes with its own chains. Eleanor's mind raced, her thoughts a cacophony of fear, doubt, and despair. The faces in the mirror stared back at her, their silent pleas echoing in her heart. She knew the truth, as much as she tried to deny it. The locket had only amplified what was already there, but it was her choices that had forged the path she now walked. Finally, with a deep, shuddering breath, Eleanor gripped the locket. The shard's glow intensified, its heat burning into her palm. She met Victor's gaze, her voice trembling but resolute. I choose freedom. Victor nodded, his expression unreadable. Then let it be done. The room erupted in a blinding light, the mirror's surface shattering with a deafening crash. Eleanor's scream joined the cacophony as the locket burned with an intensity that consumed her entire being. For a moment, there was nothing but light and pain, an endless void that threatened to swallow her whole. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. Eleanor collapsed to the ground, her breath ragged, her body trembling. The locket lay beside her, its chain broken, its shard dull and lifeless. She touched her face, her fingers tracing unfamiliar contours. Crawling to a nearby fragment of the shattered mirror, she gazed at her reflection. The woman who stared back was a hollow husk, her features drawn and lifeless. The radiant beauty that had once captivated all who saw her was gone, replaced by a visage of shadow and despair. There was no humanity in her eyes, only the empty echoes of a soul consumed by its own darkness. Victor's voice broke the silence, soft and cutting. Freedom is not redemption, Eleanor. It is merely the absence of chains. When she turned to him, he was gone, leaving her alone in the decayed remnants of the room. The locket lay inert at her side, but its weight lingered in her hands, a reminder of the price she had paid. Gathering what little strength remained, Eleanor rose unsteadily to her feet. The world around her was silent, devoid of light and warmth. She walked forward into the shadows, her steps faltering, the echoes of her past haunting every corner of the endless dark. The silence in the house was no longer empty. It thrummed with the echoes of Eleanor's broken screams. She stood in the center of the decaying grand hall, the broken locket clutched in her trembling hands. The shadows seemed alive now, shifting and undulating like predators circling their prey. Her breath misted in the cold air, each exhalation a desperate gasp for clarity. Victor's absence left a void, but his words lingered like a curse. Freedom is not redemption. Eleanor stared at the jagged shard of the locket's mirror, now blackened and fractured, reflecting only fragments of her pallid, ruined face. Her beauty was gone, stolen by her own choice. In its place remained only despair, a gnawing, festering emptiness that clawed at her mind. She turned her gaze to the mirror fragments scattered across the floor. They reflected not the room, but horrors that twisted her stomach. Faces, distorted and grotesque, stared back at her from the glass. Her father's disappointed gaze, her childhood friend, her smile wilted by betrayal. The suitors she had toyed with, their adoration twisted into loathing, their faces warped and then split apart, morphing into ghastly shapes that defied description. Their whispers rose, a symphony of accusations that bore into her mind like nails. Eleanor fell to her knees, her fingers curling into the rotting carpet. "What have I done?" she whispered, her voice barely audible.
You've seen the truth,
a voice whispered from the shadows. It was Victor's, but it came from everywhere and nowhere. The world mirrors the soul, Eleanor, and yours is cracked, empty. "Stop it!" she shrieked, covering her ears. But the voices didn't stop. They grew louder, overlapping, distorting. Each one echoed her own words from the past, callous dismissals, cruel jests, manipulative promises. The weight of her own cruelty bore down on her like a physical force, pressing her into the floor as the shadows crept closer, their edges razor-sharp. The house shifted around her, the walls warping and curling like paper in flame. The grandeur of her estate dissolved, leaving behind jagged stone corridors that stretched endlessly into darkness. Doors lined the halls, each one slightly ajar, emitting faint cries and whispers. She crawled to her feet, the locket's broken chain dragging behind her as she staggered forward. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the floor itself sought to swallow her whole. The first door creaked open, revealing a scene from her past. A ballroom, glittering and filled with adoring eyes. Eleanor stood at the center, her gown gleaming, her laugh captivating. But then the faces around her began to melt, eyes turned hollow, mouths stretched into silent screams. Their hands reached for her, skeletal and desperate, as the air filled with the stench of decay. She backed away, only for the corridor to twist again, thrusting her toward another door. This one showed her childhood friend, sitting alone in a field where they had once played together. Eleanor's younger self stood nearby, mocking the girl for her plainness. As she laughed, the friend's image shifted, her face contorting into something monstrous. Her laughter turned to a guttural wail, her eyes filling with hatred as she lunged toward Eleanor. The door slammed shut with a deafening crash. Eleanor ran now, the locket burning in her grip. The halls seemed endless, each door offering another fragment of her sins. The suitors whose hearts she had broken, their anguish turning to rage. The family she had neglected, their disappointment now a crushing silence. With every step, the weight of her choices pressed harder, driving her to her knees. The locket's shard glowed faintly, casting distorted reflections of her twisted visage across the stone walls. The shadows thickened, encircling her. She clutched at her throat, gasping for air, as a terrible realization bloomed within her. The locket had not cursed her. It had simply shown her what she truly was. The beauty she had prized so dearly had only masked the rot that had always festered beneath. Victor appeared before her, emerging from the darkness like a phantom. He looked down at her, his expression a mask of indifference. "Did you think freedom would absolve you? Did you think you could escape the person you made yourself into?" Eleanor's voice cracked with despair. "Please. There must be something left. Anything. I can change, I swear it." Victor crouched to meet her gaze, his voice low and sharp. "Change?" He gestured to the broken locket in her hands. "The locket is gone, Eleanor, but it never held your soul. That was always yours to twist. And now, there is nothing left to fix." Her sobs echoed through the corridor, swallowed by the unrelenting shadows. Victor rose and stepped back, his form dissolving into the darkness. "Your freedom is yours, Eleanor. Do with it what you will. But do not think you will find redemption. Not here. Not ever." As he disappeared, the corridor began to close in. The walls groaned and shifted, stone grinding against stone. Eleanor's breaths came in panicked gasps as the shadows pressed closer. She reached for the locket's shard, holding it up as if it could offer some salvation. The jagged edge reflected her face, her hollow, lifeless eyes staring back. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. The darkness swallowed her whole, leaving behind only silence. Ah, my dear listener, how the mighty do fall. Eleanor Gray, who once ruled with the radiance of her beauty, is now nothing more than a flicker in the void. Her story ends where all vanity must, in darkness, consumed by the very emptiness she created. And the locket? Oh, it remains, of course, waiting for its next owner, a whisper in the shadows, a promise too tempting to resist. Tell me, should you find yourself before such a cursed trinket, would you dare to open it? Or would you, like so many before, be drawn to your own ruin? Until next time, dear listener, tread carefully, for the cabinet of calamities is never far from reach.